Welcome to this video, the Divine Will Boot Camp. And this video is being done by request of viewers, and a number of them have requested some practical application. In other words, the theme of the questions went something like this. All this explanation and theology is great, but what is it that I actually have to do to be in the divine will? In other words, how do I do this and how do I do that? What's the best way to get started? So with that in mind, let us begin. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. I first like to start with the reason why we're here. So if you're here and you're watching this video and you're attempting to live in the divine will, there's only one reason why. And that's because our Blessed Mother has called you. And let's read this one passage. And this passage was also discussed in the 9 Choir of the Divine Will video that we did about 1 month ago. The great lady, celestial empress, and owner of the great inheritance of our will call her own children to possess her inheritance when our kingdom will be established on earth. So this speaks directly to the Our Father, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And you are the children of the divine will, and you are the heirs of this great inheritance that was just mentioned. We have a curriculum that covers a lot of ground, and we're going to go cover this ground quickly. So first, prayer. And we need to start with fusing, because that seems to be where there's questions, and with good reason. So fusing in divine will, and Luisa Picaretta, she discussed it as being fusing, say, with Jesus, her with Jesus, where she would be the one speaking when Jesus speaks. She would be the one moving when Jesus moves. She would be, Jesus' mouth would meld with her mouth, in other words. It's like a melding. And when you think about the acts, and we talk about the acts being united, we also could think about the author of those acts being united as well. Now, the fusing itself speaks to the heart of prayer. You just cannot fuse by your own volition. Prayer is a two-way street, so there's only so much that we can do by ourselves and by our own designs. To think about the teaching of Jesus in the gospel, where he said, knock, and the door shall be opened to you. Well, he told you to knock, and he didn't tell you to open the door. He said to knock on the door. And there's a big difference. And the reason is that we don't own the door. The door is the door of the palace of the king. And we're the ones to knock and petition. So we knock for entrance. So you can think of the first degree, and I can't really discuss all the subject matter here, so I'll make references to other videos and content on the channel, going back, in this case, to the video on the 4 degrees of the divine will, the first video on the channel. You think about the first degree. If you're just starting out and you just heard about the divine will and you are not practiced in it, the first thing you must do, and it's one of the reasons why part of the subject matter is to discuss the strengthening of the soul, is you have to condition yourself. You have to prepare yourself adequately. So think about knocking on the door of the palace of the king. If you're in the first degree, you may be inappropriately dressed. You may be ill-mannered. You may arrive at the door of the king with the stench of sin. And you knock, and perhaps the door is open, but you're not allowed to entry at that point. So you do that, and you maybe get a glimpse. You get a glimpse of inside the door slightly, and you really want to enter. So you prepare yourself. You go through this preparation, which we'll talk about in this video. And you arrive, and you're now in the second degree. In the second degree, you knock, and you're prepared, you're well-dressed, your manners are suitable, and you're allowed entry. But you're allowed entry and treated very formally. And you're allowed entry only to the beginning of the palace. And you see how resplendent the first rooms of the palace are. And now you're really enticed and motivated to come back again. You come back again and again and again. And at some point they become familiar with you at the palace. And they give you a tour of the other rooms. And you see that these rooms are in fact greater than the room you first saw when you entered the palace. And you're more motivated until one day you return to the palace, and not only do they show you the other rooms as usual, but they provide you with nourishment and drink, and they allow you to linger like someone who's very familiar. Again, you must spend some time in this degree, in this third degree. In the fourth degree, you enter the palace, and not only do you receive nourishment and drink, and are allowed to linger, as in the third degree, but you actually are permitted to dine with the royal family, and also to stay. Not just stay for a night, but you must stay as long as you like. And in fact, you are treated as a family member. And this speaks to a teaching of Jesus in the gospel when he said, "Who is my mother? Who is my brother or sister, but they who do the will of God?" Now, you may ask, if you're starting out, how do you go from the person who is denied entry at the door in the first degree to the one who entered in the second degree? Well, as I mentioned, there is some preparation involved, and we'll talk about the preparation in a little bit more detail, but basically you're going from someone who arrived initially improperly dressed, and now you are clothed with the virtues. You arrived as someone in the first degree, as someone with the stench of sin. However, now, that stench has been removed via the sacraments. You arrived as someone who behaved inappropriately, or was ill-mannered, in other words. And now you abound with grace, because you've detached yourselves from the lower things of this world. Now let's discuss prayer itself. And you may ask, how do I begin praying in the divine will if I'm just starting? Well, first you must know what you're praying for and about. So you must read and acquire knowledge of the divine will. And Jesus says to Louisa that each knowledge contains its own special grace. Besides that, you must always remember to whom you are praying, and pray with your heart, not with your lips. Also, in the first volume of the Book of Heaven, Louisa talks about Jesus asking her to visit him in the sacraments at the tabernacles of different churches. And it's a way of beginning the process of bilocation that's discussed in the Book of Heaven. So it's a way of acquiring that capability, and it's a capability that, as I mentioned, cannot be done on our own, but with the help of Jesus. And we talk about the differences of bilocation in the divine will as opposed to those of the saints elsewhere on the channel. It is different. It's not the same as, say, the bilocation of Padre Pio, who is known to have appeared in different places. It's quite different. So I would add a couple things. So besides visiting Jesus in the tabernacle by imagining yourself to be in a church that you're familiar with at the tabernacle while you're praying, do it with more than just one church and tabernacle. And it'll become apparent to you that as you become experienced and grow in the divine will and acquire this capability, which is a gift of God, you'll find yourself at both tabernacles at the same time. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that make sure that you also include the first tabernacle, which is in your heart. Let's turn our attention to the actual prayers of the divine will. And the first is the consecration to the divine will, which in my edition, it's found at the end of chapter 2 of the Book of Heaven. And when discussing these prayers, it's important to know that we are fusing in the divine will for all of these prayers. In all of these prayers, the intention, whether it's the Rosary, the Consecration, Pravidian Act, and the intention is to repair for all acts that were done imperfectly outside the divine will, and to perform those acts with Jesus that are divine and perform perfectly within the divine will, whether they were done by Jesus in his humanity, by the Blessed Virgin Mary, or by Adam prior to his fall, or, of course, by Luisa Picaretta, or anyone who has lived in the fourth degree after Louisa. So the Pravidian Act is the act where we recollect ourselves in the beginning of the day. We start, of course, with a very reverent Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And the idea is for us to offer all of our acts during the day together with Jesus' divine will. So we're doing all of our acts in and with the divine will, multiplied by all acts, as I mentioned, repairing for those which are done imperfectly, and performing with Jesus those that were done in the divine will. And it's not important for me to provide the actual prayers here. There's beautiful prayers that are easily found for the Pravidian Act and the rounds. When we go into the rounds, what we want to do is exactly what I mentioned. It's the object of the rounds. Perform with Jesus those acts which were done in the divine will, whether in the creation, the redemption, sanctification. And of course, the creation is ongoing, the redemption is ongoing. The sanctification is also continuous. This is not just acts of the past. These are acts of the past, present, and future. Now, regarding the rounds, and all prayers are also acts within the divine will. And because they are acts, they also have the quality of reparation. So all acts that we do in the divine will, whether it's a prayer of the rounds or any other prayer or any activity that we conduct in the divine will, should be with the object of repairing for those acts that were done outside of the divine will, and repeating or performing with Jesus those acts that are in the divine will. The Rosary. Jesus actually mentions the Rosary, and I'm not aware of any other mystic where Jesus discusses the Rosary. And I believe that's the case is because he wishes to give the glory to his mother regarding the Rosary. And when he does mention the Rosary in the Book of Heaven, he refers to it as her beads. And he says, by her beads, the kingdom of the divine will be called down to earth. So the Rosary is very important, and we usually don't think of it as peculiar to the divine will, and of course it's not, but it's definitely part of the divine will. It's definitely part of what you're expected to do, just like you're expected to attend the sacraments, attend church, and go by the true magisterium of the church in all things, and also to adhere to the teachings of the virtues, regarding the virtues. It's all part of what you're expected to do within the divine will. And of course, there's the gift of the divine will, which was not known until now. And that gift is what we're talking about here. We're talking about the ability to enter into the palace of the king and become a family member, to be treated as if you are a resident in the palace, as if you are an owner of the palace. And it is that ownership which was not previously provided. It's an ownership that we share with the divinity in the divine will, because you're sharing in a divine aspect of God, his divine will. An important part of prayer, I would say also, is if you come from a regimen, if you come from a life you had a regimen of prayer already established, then integrate that regimen within the divine will. A good example is there's morning prayers you have. Well, integrate aspects of the Pravidian Act within those morning prayers. Make those morning prayers about repairing and repeating acts that were done in the divine will. One other note of caution is when people begin anything, and when they begin anything that's new, there tends to be a lot of zealousness that's associated with the initial excitement when you begin something. And the divine will is no different. And divine will can be very exciting. And you're receiving graces. You're being inspired. Be careful. Don't overextend yourself. Don't overextend yourself where you're monopolizing your day with prayer after verbal prayer. That's not the intent. You'll put yourself in a position where something will change in your life and you'll become discouraged. What's more important is to focus in on the actual quality of your prayer. All of your acts you do, even outside the rosaries, the rounds, the Pravidian Act, all of your acts become a prayer in the divine will, because those acts are being performed in unity with Jesus' divine will. And this is an excellent segue into the next subject, which is the acts. And for that, I'd like to start off with this passage. It's from volume 24, April 29th, 1928. As the soul begins to be resigned to look at my will in everything and to live in it, the little divine life is formed in her. And as she advances in the practice of living in my will, this divine life grows and keeps expanding to the point of filling the soul with all of this life, in such a way that nothing is left out of her but a veil that covers it and hides it within herself. And just as with the virtues, so with my will. If the creature does not give the continuous nourishment of her acts to the little divine life within herself, this life does not grow and does not fill her entirely. So a couple important points here is, first, the way we grow in the divine will is by exercising the divine will via our acts. Our daily acts throughout our whole day and night are acts that are being performed in the divine will, and this is our prayer. This is our life in the divine will. Exercising those acts in the divine will, in the shared will with Jesus. The other important aspect of this is that it needs to be continuous. In other words, it needs to be exercised. Stagnation in the spiritual life is not equilibrium. Stagnation is not status quo. Stagnation is to go backwards in the spiritual life. You must always go forward. And it also mentions the virtues, which is the next topic. So these are tied together very well as one supports the other. the idea here is just like the acts need to be continuously exercised, so do the virtues. So let's go look at the virtues and talk about them a bit. And again, we have another passage. This is from the Hours of the Passion. And if you have any misunderstanding, or if you have any questions about how the virtue relates to the divine will, then this passage, I believe, is all that you need. Let us suppose that Jesus places us in the circumstance of exercising patience. And this is Luisa Picaretta speaking here. He receives so grave and so many offenses from creatures that he feels moved to resort to chastisements to strike the creatures. And here he gives us the opportunity to exercise patience. And we must give him honor, bearing everything with peace, just as Jesus does. And our patience will snatch from his hands the chastisements that other creatures draw from him, because he will exercise his own divine patience within us. Again, that fusing. And just as with patience, the same with all the other virtues. In the sacrament, loving Jesus exercises all virtues. From him we will draw fortitude, docility, patience, tolerance, humility, obedience. And there's one more excerpt here from volume 35, August 9th, 1937. And this is Jesus speaking to Luisa. In my will, virtues are at the most heroic and divine degree. So I'm going to speak clearly here, and I'm not speaking hyperbole. I'm speaking truth regarding the virtues. And the truth is that the smallest act of a virtue, say this, an act of charity as an example, in the divine will, is greater than the most heroic act of virtue performed by the saints who were not in the divine will. In other words, they did not have an opportunity to acquire the gift of the divine will. And that's because you're performing that act in participation with Jesus in his divine will. And that gives that act infinite merit. Also, another, just make sure that everyone understands, no one enters the fourth degree without exercising the virtues. And as Jesus mentions here again, I'm going to repeat it. In my will, virtues are at the most heroic and divine degree. I'd like to speak quickly about intercession. And I assume everyone would turn to our Blessed Mother for intercession, of course, as the primary recourse for intercession. But I want to point out a few other very important intercessors. And one are the angels. Everyone has a guardian angel. And unfortunately, and I'm guilty of this as well, our guardian angels have been neglected somewhat. Our relationships we should be building with our guardian angels are somewhat neglected. And I would say that from almost everyone. We all have our favorite saints and we pray to St. Michael, but our guardian angels are, even though they're with us all times, they're often neglected. So a recommendation, next time you go to Mass, accept that communion. The infinite merits of that communion, accept that for your guardian angel. And pray to him. And ask for his intercession daily. Also, St. Joseph. St. Joseph was said of the saints that a devotion to St. Joseph was a sign of predestination. And St. Joseph is a tremendous advocate and intercessor. And these are a couple prayers to the angels and St. Joseph that are part of the prayer of consecration to the divine will that I mentioned is at the end of volume 2 in the Book of Heaven. And one more very important intercessor is Saint Annabelle de Francia. And I'm going to read this from volume 20, November 6, 1926. This is Jesus to Louisa. Do you think that the coming of Father de Francia, who shows so much interest and who has taken to heart the publication of what regards my will, came by chance? No. No, I myself disposed it. It is a providential act of the supreme will that wants him as the first apostle of the divine fiat and proclaimer of it. So here Jesus is characterizing St. Annabelle de Francia, who was a staunch advocate and publisher of Louisa's writings. He says that St. de Francia was the first apostle of the divine fiat. So if he could be the first apostle of the divine will, and he could be the confessor of Luisa Piccarreta, he can be an excellent advocate and intercessor for us as we journey through the degrees of the divine will and try to advance to our fourth degree. Of course, it goes without saying, you should also have Luisa Piccarreta as a primary advocate and intercessor for you as well. Now let's talk about exercising or conditioning the soul. And we do that by undoing attachments. And we have a couple passages to read here. First is from volume 2, May 7th, 1899. No one can fill the void of this heart but souls who are detached, naked and simple. In fact, as you see, since the door is small, any hindrance, even the slightest, that is a shadow of attachment, an intention which is not upright, a work done without the purpose of pleasing me, prevents them from entering to delight in my heart. Now, there's been some that I've heard teaching that you can live with an attachment and it is not in fact you that are living the attachment, but because you're in the divine will, it is Jesus that is living it. And therefore it's a divine act. So I want to say that's not correct, and I want to be very clear about that as well. Jesus does not want to watch 4 hours of soap operas every morning. And Jesus does not want to watch 7 hours of football on the weekend. If you're doing that, you're not doing God's will. So you might say, well, I need to watch some TV because we do it as a family. And okay, as long as that is not immoral. Also, you can use it as an opportunity to tame your own human will. A good way of doing that, if you're sitting there with your family, don't express any opinion on what you like to see on TV. Let your wife decide. Let your family members decide. And that's a way of taking that time that you have with your family and putting it to good use, and also a way of subjugating your own human will in matters. And speaking of that, so I want to be clear about this as well. Your vocation, whether you're a father, you're a wife, you're a daughter, you're a grandmother, your vocation is God's will for you. And living in the divine will should make you better at that vocation. So you do not need to be worried about conflicts between living in divine will and your vocation, whether it's secular or whether you're religious. And let's read the next passage. While my grace is all motion and life for them, they render it immobile, and they cling to what they like, to their fuss, to human attachments, and to everything in which they feel the satisfaction of their own self. Therefore, in the place of grace, they put their own self as life and as their own idol. Volume 17, July 20th, 1925. And it reminds me of discussion we had in the 4 Degrees of the Divine Will, which is also a video which is aimed to help people advance in the divine will. We talked about there not being, and this was a presentation done by Dr. Tomasini, who was involved with the divine will for decades. And he also was involved in a translation of the Book of Heaven. He mentioned that there's no football in the 4th degree, and that's correct. There's no football in the 4th degree, and we talk about that as an analogy of going through the degrees in the video that I mentioned. And I recommend that if you haven't seen that, to watch that in its entirety. And it brings to mind something that Jesus said to Louisa, and this was, again, in one of the earlier volumes. I'm not sure if it was 2 or 1, but those volumes were preparatory, and they are very pertinent to this video for that reason. Louisa was thinking about a visit from her family that she was going to have later that day. She was thinking about not seeing them for a while. She was thinking about the family members. She was thinking about what they would discuss and what she wanted to talk about. And Jesus appeared to her and said, "What does any of this have to do with my will?" So as you go from 1st degree to the 4th degree, you'll gradually lose interest. So as you go from the 1st degree to the 4th degree, you'll lose interest in these attachments. And again, not attachment, not part of your vocation. Your vocation you will not lose interest in. In fact, as I mentioned, you'll become better, more efficacious, more effective in your vocation. But the important point that I'd like to stress here is that you cannot enter the 4th degree of the divine will if you're subjected to inordinate attachments. Let's move on to our next topic, which is spiritual warfare. And that's aligned with our theme regarding the Divine Will Bootcamp. So the first topic in this subject is know the enemy. And the enemy, of course, is Satan. Now, as Satan gains influence over a soul, Satan will exercise that soul in sin, just like we discussed exercising ourselves with acts in the divine will. And Satan will take that soul from lesser to greater evil. Now, within the divine will, as you advance in it, Satan has less and less influence over you. And as you advance in it, you will only be vulnerable to temptations from the devil and distractions. So the devil is like a guerrilla fighter. He'll use whatever tactics he can to just even distract you from living in the divine will. And sometimes those distractions can be even comical, but they're distractions notwithstanding. So what I recommend is that you use the prayer of the church that you were given, the St. Michael's prayer, and direct that against any demonic attack, whether it's direct in the form of temptation or it's direct in the form of distraction, or it's indirect by the devil influencing others that he does have influence over to attack you or distract you. And I found that in practice to be very helpful. And the further you are in the divine will, the more helpful it will be. The second topic is know the terrain. And unfortunately, the terrain is the end times, and we are suffering from an apostasy of faith. And it's very prevalent. So one thing to remember, we just went through the topic of the virtues, and Luisa Picaretta discussing the patience in face of chastisements. That's the posture that we must take. We must look to our Blessed Virgin Mother as a model who lived with great patience during her tribulations. But it's important to remember, as we discussed in the beginning, you are the children of the divine will. Do not worry. Do not be embroiled in division, because you're only adding to it. And you're only adding to the work of Satan by doing that. Stay away from division. I don't care what side you're referring to. Do not embroil yourself in conflict. In other words, carry yourself in patience and virtue. You're the children of the divine will. You weren't born to be fodder for the end times. Do not worry. Everything is under control. This is God's will that you see unfolding. And what we must do is take up the shield of faith to protect us from the arrows of the apostates. Let our sword be the cross of the redemption, and let within our hearts burn the fire of sanctification, to light up the night and to serve as a bonfire, to bring back home those who are lost. I want to thank you for watching. I think that I have the best viewers out there. Please like and subscribe, help us promote this content, and make any comments or questions that you have part of this video. Thank you. And God bless.